The wind in Dustwater had teeth. It was a late autumn wind, but it carried the premature bite of a long winter, gnawing at the edges of the Wyoming territory and spitting bits of ice that stung the skin like sand. It swept down from the Bighorn Mountains, unimpeded across the sparse, frost-hardened plains, and funneled itself through the town's single, muddy street. The street was little more than a wound between two rows of gray, unpainted buildings, a general store, a saloon that doubled as Mabel Quinn's boarding house, a livery, and a squat stone building with a tarnished star nailed to the door for the sheriff. At the edge of town, where the prairie grass gave way to a small, quiet cemetery, the wind made a low, moaning sound as it passed through the leaning headstones. One grave, fresher than the rest, was marked by a simple wooden cross. It was broken. One arm had splintered clean off, not by the wind, but by a force more careless and final. It lay on the frozen mound of earth like a discarded bone. This was where Nora Hart's world had fractured 6 months ago. Nora Hart did not visit the grave today. The cold was a practical matter, not an emotional one. It demanded work. At 24, she had the quiet competence of someone much older. Her face, framed by dark hair, pulled back so tightly it seemed to tug at the corners of her observant gray eyes. She was a blacksmith's widow, but the title felt ill-fitting, like a dress made for another woman. She was a woman who owned a small patch of land, a sturdy cabin, and a forge that now stood cold more often than not. Her husband, Liam, had been a good man, with hands that could coax steel into any shape and a laugh that could fill their small cabin. The North Spur and Cattle Company had said he was drunk when he fell from the half-finished railroad bridge. They had called it an accident. Nora knew Liam's tolerance for whiskey, and she knew his sureness of foot. The two did not add up to a fatal fall. Her current task was mending the stable door. The wood, seasoned and tough, had been warped by the relentless cycle of freeze and thaw. She worked with an economy of motion Liam had taught her. Her hands, though slender, showing the faint calluses of hard labor. The rhythmic rasp of her plane shaving away the swollen wood was a lonely sound against the vast, windy silence. Her property was small, but it was hers, and more importantly, it held Hart's Run, a creek that trickled down from the mountains, clear and constant, a ribbon of life in the parched landscape. It was the reason she would not sell, and the reason Barrett Kane wanted her gone. From a ridge in the foothills of the Bighorns, Beckett Cole watched the small plume of smoke rising from the cabin's chimney. He was a tall man, lean and weathered, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending too much time alone with the sky. At 31, his face was a map of hard miles, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a winter horizon. He had been a scout for the cavalry, a job that required him to read the land like a book. He had read it so well that he'd led a column of soldiers into a shallow valley for a surprise attack that had turned into a slaughter. He never spoke of it, but the memory lived in the tight set of his jaw and the way he always positioned himself with his back to a wall. He had left that life behind, trading his uniform for buckskin and taking a vow of solitude. He carried a Bowie knife on his hip and a Colt Peacemaker, holstered and tied down, a weapon he had promised himself he would never draw for pay or for anger again. He had seen the widow in town a few times. He noted the way she moved, with a purpose that seemed to defy the weariness hanging over Dustwater. He saw the strength in her shoulders and the absence of fear in her eyes. He also saw the loneliness that clung to her like trail dust, a feeling he knew all too well. He turned his horse, a tough little buckskin, and nudged it back toward his cabin, a small, solid structure hidden deep in a stand of pines. Trouble was coming for that woman and her patch of land. He could read the signs as easily as he could read a broken twig on a game trail. Barrett Kane's North Spur Railroad was like a slow-moving snake, and it would swallow everything in its path. Barrett Kane was a man who believed the world was a commodity. Land, water, law, people. They all had a price. His North Spur and Cattle Company was more than a business. It was an empire in the making, and the steel rails being hammered into the earth were its spine. He wanted Hart's Run. Diverting the creek would water his vast herds and feed the thirsty steam engines at the coaling station he planned to build. The widow was an obstacle, a stubborn little rock in the path of his river of progress. He had made a generous offer, then a less generous one. Now, his patience, a resource far scarcer than his money, had run out. Dustwater itself held its breath. The townsfolk were caught between the old ways of self-reliance and the new, iron-fisted power of the railroad. They were tired. They had fought the land, the weather, and the loneliness of the frontier for so long that the fight had been worn out of them. They saw Nora Hart as a complication, and in a place where survival depended on simplicity. Complications were unwelcome. A widow was bad luck, a reminder of how quickly a life could be extinguished. The story of Liam Hart's drunken fall was easier to believe than the alternative, because the alternative meant that Barrett Kane's reach extended even to the high scaffolding of a bridge. And that was a terrifying thought. Sheriff Amos Pike embodied the town's wavering soul. He was a man whose sense of duty was in a constant wrestling match with his sense of self-preservation. He wore his star like it was too heavy for his shirt, his face etched with the worry of a man trying to serve two masters, the law and Barrett Kane. When Nora had first questioned the official report on Liam's death, Pike had shuffled his feet and mumbled about the dangers of construction sites, his eyes refusing to meet hers. Only Mabel Quinn, the proprietor of the boarding house, seemed immune to the town's collective fatigue, a woman built like a beer barrel with a tongue as sharp as a skinning knife. She made no secret of her disdain for Kane and his imported thugs. Progress. She'd snort, wiping down her bar with a damp rag. Just another word for taking what ain't yours. She had a soft spot for Nora, often leaving a warm loaf of bread or a jar of preserves on her doorstep. Small acts of solidarity in a town that preferred to look the other way. Deacon O'Rourke, the town's preacher, offered prayers and quiet wisdom, his faith tempered by a clear-eyed understanding of human weakness. And, out in the wilderness, the old trapper Ephraim Dodd watched the changing landscape with a heavy heart, understanding better than anyone the true cost of Kane's iron horse. That afternoon, as the sun began its descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow-dusted ground, Nora finished her work on the stable door. It now closed flush and true, a small victory against the encroaching decay. She gathered her tools, the familiar weight of the hammer in her hand a comforting link to Liam. As she turned to head back to the cabin, a piece of paper nailed to the door caught her eye. It was a crisp, official-looking document, foreign against the weathered gray wood. Her heart went cold, a cold that had nothing to do with the wind. She stepped closer. The words were stark, printed in unforgiving black ink. Notice of foreclosure. It spoke of delinquent taxes, of property to be seized by the county on behalf of its primary creditor. And at the bottom, pressed into a blob of red wax, was a seal. It was not the seal of the county or the territory. It was the stylized image of a bull's head and a railroad spike, the emblem of the North Spur and Cattle Company. The air left her lungs in a white puff of vapor. It was a lie. She had paid her taxes. She had the receipts tucked away in a small wooden box inside the cabin. This was not law. It was theft wrapped in legal paper. The whispers in town. The sheriff's averted eyes. The broken cross on Liam's grave. It all coalesced into a single, chilling certainty. This had been the plan all along. She stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping strands of hair across her face. The weary pragmatism of Dustwater told her to surrender, to take what little she could get and leave. A lone woman could not fight a man like Barrett Kane. The world was a hard place, and justice was a luxury few could afford. But Nora Hart was Liam Hart's wife. She was made of the same stubborn, resilient material as the steel he used to shape. She looked from the notice to the cold forge standing silent near the cabin. It was more than a building. It was her history, her inheritance. Her gaze fell upon the creek. Hart's Run, still flowing, still whispering its song of survival. A slow, burning anger, pure and clean as forge fire, began to glow in her chest. She did not tear the paper down. She did not weep. Her movements became deliberate, imbued with a cold and sudden purpose. She turned and walked not to the cabin, but back to the forge. Her hand closed around the handle of a heavy smithing hammer, its head polished smooth from years of Liam's grip. The weight felt right. It felt like a promise. She walked back to the stable, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. The setting sun painted the undersides of the clouds in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. She stopped before the notice, a white scar on the heart of her home. She raised the hammer, its polished face catching the last of the dying light. She did not aim for the paper. She aimed for the thick head of the nail pinning it to her door. The hammer fell. The sound was not a dull thud, but a sharp, ringing crack that cut through the whine of the wind. Metal struck metal. A shower of bright orange sparks erupted in the twilight, a fleeting constellation of defiance. The notice, freed from its anchor, fluttered for a moment in the air before landing face down in the dirt. Nora let the hammer fall to her side, her knuckles white around the handle. The wind could have its say, the winter could come. Barrett Kane could have his railroad, but he would not have this. Not without a fight. The sparks from the hammer blow died in the frigid air, but the echo of the strike lingered. It was a sound of finality, a single, sharp note of refusal that Nora felt in the bones of her arm. For 2 days, that echo was the only reply to her defiance. No one from the North Spur Company came. No one from the sheriff's office rode out to ask why a legal notice was lying in the mud. The silence was a different kind of pressure. A heavy blanket of anticipation that made the familiar sounds of her homestead the creak of the cabin floor, the sigh of the wind in the eaves feel strange and menacing. Her supplies were running low. The winter promised to be long, and a lone woman could not afford to be caught unprepared. Resigned, she hitched her steady mare, Agnes, to the small buckboard and made the slow journey into Dustwater. The town seemed to watch her as she passed, eyes peering from behind dusty window panes before quickly looking away. She was no longer just the blacksmith's widow. She was the woman who had struck a hammer against Barrett Kane's will in Dustwater. That made her either a fool or a ghost. She tied Agnes in front of the general store and went inside, the little bell over the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle that felt entirely out of place. The store owner, a balding man named Silas, busied himself rearranging tins on a shelf. His back to her, she gathered her flour, salt, and beans, the silence in the store growing thicker with each item she placed on the counter. When she was done, Silas tallied the cost without a word, his fingers moving stiffly. As she was counting out the coins, the bell jingled again. Vince Mallory stepped inside, bringing with him the smell of cheap cigar smoke and entitlement. He was Kane's foreman, a man whose authority came not from respect, but from the size of the payroll he managed and the 2 hard-faced men who flanked him like bookends. He was broad in the shoulder and soft in the belly, his face florid from too much whiskey and too much sun. He saw Nora, and a slow, unpleasant smile spread across his lips. He sauntered over to the counter, leaning against it with a proprietary air. "Well now, Mrs. Hart, doing a little shopping, stocking up for the winter." Nora kept her eyes on the coins in her hand. "I am." Mallory chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "A tough season for a woman on her own. A real tough season. A body needs protection, friends in the right places." He picked up a sack of her flour, testing its weight. "Mr. Kane. He's a generous man. He understands a widow's predicament. He was just saying the other day. He has a large house, needs a good woman to look after it, a personal housekeeper. You might say, keep things tidy. In exchange, he'd be willing to forget all about this tax business. See that you're looked after." The implication hung in the air, thick and greasy as month-old bacon fat. Silas froze, his hand hovering over the cash drawer. The two men with Mallory grinned. Nora slowly finished counting her coins, placing them deliberately on the counter. She looked up, her gray eyes meeting Mallory's for the first time. They were flat and cold. She said nothing. She simply picked up the nearly full glass of water Silas kept on the counter for thirsty customers and, with a flick of her wrist, threw its contents directly into Vince Mallory's smiling face. The shock on his face was immediate, followed by a sputtering rage. Water dripped from his nose and chin, plastering his hair to his forehead. For a moment, the only sound was his choked gasp, before he could lunge or curse or do whatever he intended to do. The bell over the door jingled a third time. Beckett Cole filled the doorway. He was there to pay for a saddle he had left with the liverymen for restitching. A simple transaction, but the scene before him was anything but simple. He saw the furious, dripping foreman, the two tense men at his side, and the widow, standing perfectly still behind the counter, her expression unreadable but for the defiant set of her jaw. He took it all in with a single, sweeping glance. He did not move to intervene. He did not speak. He simply met Nora's eyes for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It was not a promise of help. It was an acknowledgement, a sign that he had seen. Then he stepped aside, letting the tension in the room belong to those who had created it. Mallory, his rage momentarily checked by the newcomer's presence, wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. He glared at Nora, his voice a low hiss. "You will regret that. I promise you." He turned on his heel and stormed out, his men following close behind. The silence they left in their wake was profound. Silas finally let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since Mallory walked in. He quickly swept Nora's payment into the drawer. "You best be careful. Nora, that's a bad man to cross." "Some things are worth the trouble," she said quietly. Beckett, still standing by the door, heard her. He paid the liveryman, who had come in from the back room, and left without another glance in her direction. But the small, silent exchange lingered in Nora's mind. A stranger had seen her stand her ground, and he had not judged her for it. Later that afternoon, as a low, gray ceiling of clouds began to press down on the bighorns, Tom Nettles, the young mail rider, galloped up to her cabin. He was a bundle of nerves, constantly looking over his shoulder. "A letter for you, Mrs. Hart," he said, his voice cracking. He thrust a folded piece of paper into her hand. Not an official mail pouch envelope, but a personal note. Didn't come through the post. A man gave it to me on the trail. Paid me $1 to make sure it got to you, and only you. Before Nora could ask who, Tom had spurred his horse and was gone, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Nora unfolded the paper. Inside were two things. The first was a detailed sketch, a schematic for a small but effective dam and diversion channel. It was professionally drawn, with measurements and angles that spoke of engineering knowledge. At the bottom, in a bold, arrogant hand, was a signature V, Mallory. The second item was a short, unsigned note, the handwriting shaky and hurried. It read, "This is their plan for your creek. On the night your husband died. I was hunting late. I saw a lantern burning near the shore, down by stake marker 17. Nora's hands trembled as she read it again. Stake marker 17. The survey stakes for the new railroad line ran along the far side of the river, near the base of the new bridge. It was a lead, a real, tangible lead. The anonymous author was a coward, but they had given her a weapon. She folded the letter and tucked it deep into her apron pocket, her mind racing. The next day, she saw Sheriff Pike in town. She approached him, determined to force the issue. "Sheriff," she began, her voice steady, "I have reason to believe my husband's death was no accident." Pike sighed, a long, weary sound. He took off his hat and wiped his brow. Though the air was cold, "Nora, we've been over this. It was a tragedy, but the foreclosure notice on my door was signed by the North Spur Company, not the county." "A clerical error, I'm sure," he said, his eyes scanning the street. looking anywhere but at her. Listen to me. Barrett Kane is bringing progress to this territory. The railroad means civilization. It means jobs, supplies, a future. Sometimes, for the greater good. Small sacrifices have to be made. Sell the land. Nora, take the money and start fresh somewhere else. It's the smart thing to do. The safe thing. So your advice is to let a thief steal my land and get away with murder? Before Pike could answer, Mabel Quinn's voice cut through the air like a bullwhip. She was standing on the boardwalk in front of her saloon, arms crossed over her formidable chest. Civilization, she called out, her voice dripping with scorn. If that's what civilization looks like, Amos, I'll take my chances with the coyotes. At least they're honest about being predators. The sheriff's face flushed. He mumbled something about keeping the peace, jammed his hat back on his head, and walked away. His stride quickening, Nora looked over at Mabel, who gave her a grim, supportive smile. The message was clear: the law would not help her. She was on her own. That night, she made her decision. The moon was nearly full. A cold, silver dollar in the sky. Its light bright enough to ride by. The clouds had thickened, and the wind carried the sharp, clean scent of imminent snow. But she could not wait. She saddled Agnes, strapping a small pickaxe and a lantern to the saddle, just in case. She pulled on her thickest coat and rode out, not toward town, but toward the river and the dark skeleton of the unfinished bridge. The air grew colder as she neared the water. The mountains loomed like sleeping giants, their peaks wreathed in dark, churning clouds. She found the line of survey stakes easily enough, their wooden tops painted a faded red. She counted them as she rode past. 15, 16, 17. Stake marker 17 was driven into the muddy bank of the river, just a few yards from the massive stone pier that would support the bridge. She dismounted, her boots sinking into the soft, cold earth. She lit her lantern, its warm glow pushing back the oppressive darkness. She began to search, her eyes scanning every inch of the ground. At first, she saw nothing out of the ordinary, just mud, rocks, and the detritus of construction. But then, she noticed something odd. In a patch of softer ground, partially shielded by a willow thicket, were impressions, faint, but definitely there. The crescent shape of a shod horse, and beside it, the deeper, oblong print of a man's boot. But they were strange. The edges were smeared, the details deliberately obscured, as if someone had dragged a branch over them, trying to erase their existence. It was clumsy work, but the intent was clear. A sudden chill, colder than the wind, ran down her spine. Someone had been here, and they had not wanted anyone to know. This was the work of someone trying to hide their tracks, and the half-hearted attempt spoke of someone who believed no one would ever come looking. A twig snapped in the darkness behind her. Nora spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sounding small against the rush of the river. There was no answer, only the wind. But she was no longer alone. She could feel it. She grabbed the lantern and held it high, its light dancing across the dark shapes of trees and rocks. Nothing. She was about to dismiss it as an animal when she heard the faint jingle of a bridle. Suddenly, two figures on horseback emerged from the shadows downstream. They were just silhouettes against the moonlight, but she could see they wore hats pulled low and had scarves covering the lower halves of their faces. They moved slowly, deliberately, their horses picking their way through the rocky terrain. Panic seized her. She scrambled back toward Agnes, her hands fumbling with the reins. One of the riders raised a rifle. She heard the click of the hammer being pulled back. She froze. The rifle cracked, the explosion deafeningly loud in the night. A bullet whined past her ear, so close she felt its heat, and slammed into the tree behind her, sending a spray of bark into the air. Agnes screamed and reared. Pulling the reins from Nora's grasp, Nora stumbled backward, her heel catching on an exposed root. The ground gave way beneath her. She cried out as she fell, tumbling down a short, steep embankment of loose rock and snow. Her head struck something hard, a flash of white-hot pain, and then the world went dark. She was vaguely aware of another sound, a second gunshot, this one from a different direction, sharper, a pistol's retort, then the sound of hoofbeats, fading quickly into the distance. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, disconnected. A shadow fell over her. She felt strong hands grip her arm, pulling her up from the edge of a dark, fast-moving current of water at the bottom of the ravine. Her vision swam back into focus. A man was kneeling over her, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. The moonlight caught the silver on his pistol as he slid it back into its holster. He was solid and real, and his back was dusted with fresh snow. He smelled of pine. It was the man from the store, Beckett Cole. He helped her to her feet. She swayed, and he steadied her with a hand on her elbow. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "My head," she managed, touching the tender spot. Her fingers came away clean. He nodded, his gaze sweeping the area, checking for any remaining threats. He found Agnes a short distance away, calming the trembling horse with a few soft words. He led the mare back to Nora. "They're gone," he said. He did not ask what she was doing out here alone in the middle of the night. He did not ask who the men were. He simply took the reins and started walking, leading her and the horse away from the river, taking a steep, narrow path that cut directly into the foothills. It was a shortcut, a path only a local would know. They walked in silence, the only sounds their footsteps and the sighing of the wind in the pines. The questions hung in the air between them, unspoken but immense. As he helped her mount her horse at the top of the ridge, the moonlight fell across his hands. Nora saw it then, a pale, jagged line running across the back of his right wrist. A scar, long and deep, a remnant of a past as mysterious as the man himself. The shortcut was a merciless climb. The wind, which had been a steady, biting force on the flatlands, became a predator in the foothills. It shrieked through the narrow gaps in the rock, tearing at their clothes and flinging ice crystals that felt like powdered glass against their exposed skin. The first snowflakes were small and dry, almost insignificant, but Beckett Cole read them like a warning. He looked up at the roiling, bruised belly of the clouds that had swallowed the moon and the stars. There was no sky left. "We are not going to make it to your place," he said, his voice raised to be heard over the rising gale. It was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. The path down to the valley was exposed, and the snow was beginning to fall with a blinding intensity, a vertical curtain of white that erased the world. Nora did not argue. She could feel the temperature dropping with an unnatural speed, and her horse, Agnes, was becoming skittish, tossing her head and sidestepping nervously. The darkness was no longer just the absence of light. It was a smothering presence, thick with snow and sound. She was a capable woman, but she knew the foolishness of fighting a Wyoming blizzard. She nodded, her trust placed not in the man himself, but in his undeniable competence. He knew this land. He had saved her life. For now, that was enough. He led them off the barely visible trail and into a dense stand of lodgepole pines. The trees offered a slight reprieve from the wind's direct assault, but the snow still swirled down, piling in drifts against the trunks. For what felt like an hour, they pushed through the forest, the only sounds the creak of saddle leather, the muffled plodding of the horses, and the howl of the storm. Just when Nora began to feel a deep, penetrating cold seep into her bones, a solid shape emerged from the white chaos ahead. A cabin. It was small and low to the ground, built of thick-notched logs chinked tightly with mud and moss. A stone chimney stood sentinel at one end, and a single, small window stared out into the storm like a watchful eye. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, a deliberate and final statement against the wilderness. Beckett slid from his horse and pushed open the heavy plank door, revealing a cavern of absolute blackness. He led the horses into a small lean-to attached to the side of the cabin, a space just large enough to shelter them from the worst of the weather. Then he took Nora's arm and guided her inside. The moment the door shut behind them, the world changed. The roar of the wind diminished to a low, mournful moan. The biting cold was replaced by a still, cellar-like chill. The darkness was total. Nora stood frozen, her senses straining. She heard him moving, the scuff of his boots on a wooden floor, the soft clink of metal. A match scraped, and a tiny flower of flame bloomed in the darkness. He touched it to the wick of a tallow candle jammed into the neck of an empty bottle on a rough-hewn table. The light flickered, grew steady, and pushed the shadows back into the corners, revealing the small space they now shared. It was a single room, a stone fireplace, deep and black, dominated one wall. A narrow bunk with a neatly folded stack of woolen blankets was built into another. The table with the candle, 2 simple chairs, and a few shelves holding tins and sacks of food were the only furnishings. It was a space stripped of everything but necessity. It was clean, orderly, and profoundly lonely. In a corner, sitting on a wooden stand, was a worn saddle, its leather dark with age and use, the seat polished smooth by countless miles. Beckett took her snow-covered coat without a word and hung it on a wooden peg near the hearth. He did the same with his own. Then, in a gesture that seemed both deliberate and significant, he unbuckled his gun belt. He did not set it on the table or lay it on his bunk. He walked to the far wall and hung the Colt, still in its holster, on a peg high above her head, well out of his own easy reach. It was a clear and silent message: you are safe from me. Nora's wariness, a constant companion since her husband's death, eased its grip on her heart just a little. She was still a woman alone with a stranger, trapped by a force of nature, but the stranger had just disarmed himself. He had offered a truce without speaking a word. She watched as he knelt and began to build a fire, his movements economical and sure. Soon, the kindling caught, and flames began to lick at the larger logs, their crackling a welcome sound in the heavy silence. Warmth began to creep into the room, a living thing. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. He looked up from the fire, his face half in shadow, the candlelight carving deep lines around his eyes. The mountain decides who travels and who waits. Tonight, it told us to wait. He rose and moved to the small cooking area near the hearth. He took down a heavy cast-iron pot and began to scoop dried beans into it from a sack. He added water from a bucket and a chunk of salt pork, then hung the pot on a hook over the growing fire. They settled into a strange domesticity, dictated by the storm outside. The cabin was a small island in a roaring sea of white. The single room forced them into an intimacy that was both tense and comforting. They were close enough to hear each other breathe, yet a vast, unspoken distance remained between them. Nora found herself watching him, trying to piece together the man from the scraps of evidence around her. The neatly stacked firewood, the mended shirt hanging on a peg, the single, chipped ceramic mug. This was not the camp of a drifting cowhand. This was the refuge of a man who had chosen solitude and mastered it. He broke the silence. There was a bad business at Fort Laramie a few years back. The words came out of nowhere, as if a thought had slipped its leash. He was staring into the fire, his hand clenching and unclenching at his side. He seemed to regret speaking as soon as the words were out. A shadow passed over his features, a darkness that had nothing to do with the flickering light. "I was there. I learned that some things are not worth the price. I swore then I would not be shooting for money again." The confession, though vague, was a crack in his armor. It explained the gun on the wall, the isolation, the haunted look that sometimes settled in his eyes. He was a man with a ledger to balance, and he was trying to do it alone, up here in the mountains. Nora felt a flicker of empathy for this quiet, dangerous man. He had a code. She had seen it when he fired a warning shot instead of aiming at the men by the river. She saw it now in the way he kept a respectful distance. ensuring she never felt cornered in the small space. As the savory smell of the simmering beans began to fill the cabin, the silence returned. But it was different now, less awkward, more thoughtful. The storm raged, rattling the single window and puffing smoke back down the chimney. The shared meal, when it was ready, was a simple affair. He ladled the thick stew into 2 tin bowls and handed one to her. They ate, sitting at the small table, the candle between them casting dancing shadows on their faces. Nora took a spoonful. The beans were tender, but the broth was incredibly salty. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time that night. "These beans are as salty as a losing poker player," she said, her voice soft. Beckett looked at her, a glimmer of humor in his pale eyes. He took a bite of his own, chewing thoughtfully. "It is salty," he agreed, without apology. "It helps you remember you are still alive." The dry wit, so unexpected, disarmed her completely. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not just the stoic rescuer, but a man who understood the fine line between survival and despair. A man who, like her, was holding on. In that moment, she made a choice. She had a secret that was too heavy to carry alone, and the man sitting across from her, the man who had twice saved her life and now shared his fire and his salty beans, was the only person she could trust. She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out the folded, crumpled piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the table, the candlelight falling on the intricate drawing and the shaky handwriting. "This is why those men were after me," she said. Beckett put down his spoon, his full attention on the paper. He picked it up, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle. He studied the schematic of the dam first, his eyes narrowing. He traced the lines of the diversion channel with a fingertip. He was silent for a long time, his expression unreadable. "This is not a rancher's drawing," he said finally, his voice low. "The angles, the gradients, the structural notes. This is the work of a military engineer, the kind of man who builds bridges and fortifications for the army." He looked up at her, his gaze sharp. "Where did you get this?" She told him about the mail rider, the anonymous note, the mention of the lantern at stake marker 17. As she spoke, she watched his face. He was listening with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only person in the world. He was not just hearing her words, he was weighing them, analyzing them, fitting them into a larger puzzle. He tapped the signature at the bottom of the drawing. "Vince Mallory, Kane's man." He looked back at the drawing, then at Nora. "This is more than a plan to steal your water. This is proof of a conspiracy. The man who drew this would know exactly how to weaken a bridge support. Quietly, so it would look like an accident." The words hung in the air between them, confirming her darkest fears. Liam had not fallen. He had been murdered. A wave of grief and rage washed over her, so powerful it almost stole her breath. Beckett saw it in her eyes. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply slid the paper back across the table to her, a silent acknowledgement of the burden she carried. It was in that moment of shared, heavy truth that they heard it, a sound from outside, cutting through the howl of the wind. It was faint at first, then clearer, the unmistakable jingle of a horse's bridle, followed by the low murmur of men's voices, muffled by the snow and the thick cabin walls. Beckett was on his feet in an instant, his body going taut. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. The sounds were closer now. A horse whinnied. Someone cursed the cold. They were searching for her. Nora's blood ran cold. They were trapped. The one-room cabin was a box with no back door, no place to run. Her gaze flew to the Colt hanging on the wall. Beckett saw where she was looking. He met her eyes in the flickering light. He could take down the gun. He was a skilled marksman. She had seen the proof. There could be a fight, here and now, in the heart of the storm. But she saw the conflict in his face, the deep struggle against the promise he had made to himself. To resort to violence was to become the man he had left behind in Fort Laramie. He made his choice. It was swift and silent. He moved not toward the gun, but toward the table. With a single, sharp puff of breath, he blew out the candle. The cabin was plunged into an unnerving darkness, broken only by the faint, hellish red glow from the cracks in the stove door. Before Nora could even gasp, his hand was on her arm. Strong and sure, he pulled her down, away from the window, into the deepest, darkest corner of the room, pressing them both flat against the cold log wall. "Do not move," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Do not make a sound." They crouched in the darkness, side by side, so close she could feel the steady, slow beat of his heart against her shoulder. Outside, the voices grew louder. They could hear the crunch of boots in the snow, just feet from the door. A gloved hand rattled the latch. Nora held her breath, her own heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The pursuers were at the door. One kick, and their fragile sanctuary would be breached. Time seemed to stop, stretched thin and tight as a wire. In the suffocating darkness, with danger just a heartbeat away, Nora realized she was not afraid. The man beside her had chosen to shield her with his body and his wits rather than with his gun. He had chosen silence and shadow over blood and fire. And in that choice, she finally, completely, trusted him. The world was born new in the morning. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound, muffled silence and a landscape sculpted from pristine white snow. The sun, when it finally broke through the thinning clouds, struck the surface with a light so brilliant it hurt the eyes. Beckett and Nora descended from the high country, their horses stepping carefully through drifts that were waist-deep in the hollows. They did not speak. A new understanding, fragile and unspoken, had been forged between them in the darkness of the cabin, but the clear, cold light of day made it feel uncertain. The confirmation of Liam's murder was a hard, cold stone in Nora's stomach, and the man who rode beside her was now inextricably linked to her search for the truth. They were seen the moment they reached the edge of town. A curtain twitched in the window of the assayer's office. A man chopping wood by the livery paused, his axe held mid-swing. By the time Nora had dismounted in front of Mabel's boarding house, the story had already been written, revised, and spread on the swift, invisible current of gossip. The widow had spent the night in the mountains with the reclusive horseman. Before Nora could even thank Beckett, he simply nodded, his face impassive, and turned his horse, heading back toward the foothills without a backward glance. He understood the language of a small town. His presence would only make it worse for her. Nora had barely stepped onto the boardwalk when Mrs. Gable, the self-appointed guardian of Dustwater's morals and head of the ladies' auxiliary, descended upon her. She was a tall, thin woman with a face that looked permanently puckered, as if she had just bitten into a lemon. "Nora Hart," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "A word." Mabel Quinn's door swung open. "She does not have a word for you, Beatrice," Mabel said, appearing with a broom in her hand, looking as immovable as a boulder. "Not a single letter." Mrs. Gable drew herself up, her thin lips tightening. "It is a disgrace. A woman so recently bereaved, disappearing into the wilderness with a man of his reputation. She has a duty to her husband's memory." Mabel took a step forward, her presence so formidable that Mrs. Gable instinctively took a step back. "Her husband's memory is her business," Mabel retorted, her voice low and dangerous. "And let me tell you something about reputations. I would rather trust a woman who spent a night surviving a blizzard with a quiet man than a woman who spends her days poisoning wells with a sharp tongue. Now get off my porch before I sweep you into the street with the rest of the dirt." A few cowhands loitering nearby let out muffled snorts of laughter. Mrs. Gable's face turned a blotchy red. She gave Nora one last withering look, spun on her heel, and marched away. "Pay her no mind," Mabel said, her tone softening as she turned to Nora. "Her heart is as small and dry as a year-old bean." The small victory did little to ease the weight on Nora's shoulders. She had a new, more urgent purpose now. That afternoon, she sought out Ephraim Dodd, The old trapper lived in a small dugout on the edge of town, a place that smelled of wood smoke, tanned hides, and a lifetime of solitude. He was a gnarled man with eyes that had seen more winters than the mountains themselves. When Nora showed him the engineer's drawing and told him her story, he listened without interruption, stroking his grizzled beard. "Cole was with you?" he asked when she finished. She nodded. Dodd grunted, "Good. You will need him. The boy knows how to read the ground." He agreed to help. The following morning, under a sky the color of slate, the three of them, Nora, Beckett, and Dodd, rode back out to the river. The snow had hidden much, but it could not hide everything. It was Dodd who found the spot, not far from stake marker 17. He knelt, brushing away a thin layer of powder to reveal a patch of disturbed, frozen mud. "Dynamite," he said, his voice a low rasp. He pointed with a leathery finger. "See here, the blast was small. Not enough to be heard in town, just enough to shatter the anchor stone for that main trestle. Make it weak, a man's weight, a little vibration from the work crew. It would be enough." Beckett began to search the surrounding area, his eyes scanning the ground with a scout's practiced intensity. He found it half hidden under the lip of a frozen rock, a small, waxed paper tube, empty, a blasting cap wrapper, and on its side, in faded but legible blue ink, were the words, "Eagle and Company, Explosives, Cheyenne." "Eagle and Company?" Nora breathed, her voice tight. "Barrett Kane owns it. Liam told me. He bought it last year." It was the proof she needed, tangible, damning proof. But as she took the wrapper, a new, colder realization set in. What good was proof when the law was in Kane's pocket? Her fears were confirmed when they returned to town. She went directly to the sheriff's office, the evidence clutched in her hand. Beckett and Dodd waited outside, a silent show of support. She laid the wrapper and a copy of the drawing on Sheriff Pike's desk. He looked at the items, then at her, his face a mask of official concern. But his eyes, they would not stay still. They darted from the evidence to the window, to the floor, anywhere but her face. "This is serious. Nora, very serious. I will have to take these into evidence." He carefully placed the wrapper and the drawing into a large envelope. "I will open a formal investigation immediately." "And what will that investigation find?" "Sheriff," she asked, her voice level. "Will it find that your biggest contributor is a murderer?" Pike's face hardened. "I am the law in this town. You will let me do my job." He sealed the envelope with a finality that felt like a door slamming shut. As Nora turned to leave, she knew with absolute certainty that the evidence would never see the inside of a courtroom. It would be lost or misplaced or declared inconclusive. She had handed her only weapon to the enemy as she stepped back out into the cold daylight. Dodd pulled her gently aside while Beckett went to check on the horses. The old trapper's expression was somber. "There's something you should know about Cole," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About why he is the way he is." He told her a story from 5 years before, a story of a young, eager cavalry scout, the best in the territory. He spoke of a lieutenant, ambitious and cruel, who was determined to make a name for himself. Beckett had been ordered to find a winter encampment of Shoshone, a peaceful band, but the lieutenant had called them hostiles. Beckett, doing his duty, had led the soldiers along a hidden game trail. He was just a scout, Dodd said, his eyes filled with an old sadness. His job was to find the trail, not to ask why, but the lieutenant, he did not go there to talk. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Women, children. The snow was red for a week. Beckett saw it all. That is what happened at Fort Laramie. That scar on his wrist is not from any fight. He did it to himself that night. He has been trying to wash the blood off his hands ever since. The world tilted under Nora's feet. The quiet, honorable man who had saved her, who had hung his gun on the wall to make her feel safe, had been a party to a massacre. He had led the soldiers. He had shown them the way. Dodd's story did not excuse it, but it cast a different light on the man she was beginning to trust. He was not a cold-blooded killer. He was a man living in a prison of his own guilt. A good man who was part of a bad thing, as Dodd had said. But the knowledge created a chasm between them. How could she trust a man who carried such a dark past? Beckett returned, leading her horse. He saw the look on her face, the confusion and the hurt in her eyes. He glanced at Dodd, and he knew. He said nothing. There was no defense to offer. The past was a fact, as solid and immovable as the mountains. The pressure from Kane's camp escalated that evening. Nora was in Mabel's saloon, having a quiet meal, when Vince Mallory and 4 of his men strode in. They spread out, cutting off the exits, their presence sucking all the warmth and laughter from the room. Mallory swaggered up to her table. "We have a deed of sale drawn up. Mrs. Hart, a final, very generous offer. Sign it, and you can ride out of here with enough money to start over." "My land is not for sale," Nora said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I think it is," Mallory sneered. One of his men, a lanky cowboy with cruel eyes, stepped forward. He was holding something in his hand. It was Liam's hat, a simple, felt slouch hat, worn and stained with the honest sweat of his work. Nora kept it on a peg by the door. They must have taken it from her cabin. The man smirked and, with a casual flick of his wrist, sent the hat sailing across the room. It landed with a soft splash in a puddle of spilled beer and mud on the floor. The saloon went dead silent. Every eye was on Nora. It was a calculated act of humiliation, a defilement of a sacred memory. Nora's vision blurred with tears of rage. She wanted to scream, to fly at them, to claw their eyes out, but she did not. She took a slow, deep breath, stood up from her chair, and walked calmly to where the hat lay. She bent down, picked it up, and walked back to her table. She sat down and, with her napkin, began to gently, methodically, wipe away the filth. Her hands were steady. Her expression was calm. It was an act of profound, silent defiance that was more powerful than any shouted curse. Across the street, Beckett Cole stood in the shadows of the livery, watching the scene unfold through the saloon window. He had followed her to town, a silent guardian she did not know she had. When Mallory and his men had entered, every muscle in his body had tensed. His hand had instinctively gone to his hip, to the empty space where his Colt usually hung. But his gun was back at the cabin, and even if it were not, he would not have drawn it. He had made a vow. He was a watcher now, not a fighter. But as he watched Nora's quiet act of courage, a slow, grudging respect, deeper than any he had felt before, took root in his heart. The next day, the proof of Kane's villainy became undeniable. A boy who had been fishing in Hart's Run came running into town, shouting that the creek was poisoned. The water that flowed past Nora's property, always so clear and pure, was running thick with a murky, gray silt. Dozens of small, silver-bellied trout floated on the surface, their gills struggling. Kane's men had been testing their secret dam upstream, and the runoff was killing the creek. It was an environmental wound that the entire town could see. The whispers and rumors now had a foul, tangible reality. That evening, as the last light faded from the sky, Nora saw Beckett waiting for her by the path that led out of town. The day's events had settled into a hard resolve inside her. She walked up to him, stopping a few feet away. The chasm of his past lay between them. "I know what happened at Fort Laramie," she said, her voice clear and without accusation. He did not flinch. He just nodded, his eyes holding hers. "I am grateful for what you have done for me," she continued. "But I cannot do this with a ghost. I cannot fight for Liam's name with a man whose own story is a shadow. Before we can go any further, I need the truth. Your truth. All of it." He looked at her for a long time, the silence stretching between them. She was asking for the one thing he had never given to anyone, the story of his own damnation. He saw the strength in her, the unwavering resolve in her gray eyes, and he knew she was right. She deserved the truth. He deserved to finally speak it. "Tomorrow night," he said, his voice low and raspy, "at the cabin." The ride to his cabin was different this time. Nora was not being rescued. She was keeping an appointment with a ghost. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that pressed in from all sides. But it was nothing compared to the chill of anticipation in her heart. She was afraid of what she would hear, and more afraid of what it would mean for the fragile trust that had begun to grow between them. The snow from the blizzard had settled, packed down by the wind and the cold into a hard, unforgiving crust that crunched loudly under Agnes's hooves. Every sound seemed amplified in the vast, waiting silence of the mountains. He was waiting for her outside, a dark, still figure against the blinding white of the snow. He took her horse's reins without a word and led the animal to the lean-to, his movements as economical as always. Inside, a fire was already burning low and steady in the hearth, and a single candle on the table cast a solitary circle of warm, yellow light. The cabin felt the same austere, clean, isolated, but tonight the shadows in the corners seemed deeper, filled with the weight of unspoken history. She took off her coat and sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He did not sit opposite her. Instead, he leaned against the stone mantel of the fireplace, his face half illuminated, half lost in shadow. He was giving her space, but it also felt as if he were placing himself on trial, standing before the judge. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. He stared into the flames, gathering the words, or perhaps the courage, to begin. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough thing, the sound of stones grinding together. "I was young," he started, his eyes fixed on the fire. 19. I thought I knew everything. I could read a track in solid rock, tell you the age of a campfire from the color of the ash. I was the best scout the Army had, and I was proud of it. Too proud. Pride is a poison. He paused, and Nora could hear the quiet crackle of the logs in the hearth. There was a lieutenant, a man named Cowboy. He came from a rich family back east, and he had an appetite, not for food or drink, but for glory. He wanted to make a name for himself, wanted to get his picture in the papers as an Indian fighter. He heard about a band of Shoshone wintering in a place called the Whispering Valley. They were not hostile. They were hunters, families. They had a treaty, but Calloway did not care about treaties. He cared about promotions. He pushed himself away from the mantel and began to pace the small space between the fire and the table. A caged animal restless with memory. He ordered me to find them. I told him they were peaceful. He told me my job was not to think. It was to track. The Army paid me a scout's wage. It was good money. I was sending it back home to my mother. I told myself that was what mattered. I told myself I was just a tool, like a map or a compass. A tool is not responsible for the hand that wields it. He stopped pacing and looked at her, his eyes hollow. I was a fool, a coward. Nora did not move, did not breathe. She was a statue carved from ice. I found the trail. It was not hard. They were not trying to hide. Why should they? They had done nothing wrong. I led Calloway and his company right to the mouth of the valley. It was a perfect box canyon, easy to get into, impossible to get out of in a hurry. I did my job. I pointed the way. Calloway told me to fall back with the horses. He said the fun was about to begin. His voice broke on the last word. He turned back to the fire, his shoulders slumping. I did not see it all, but I heard it. The first volley, the screams, not the shouts of warriors, but the cries of women, of children. It went on for a long time. When it was over, Calloway came back, his face flushed, his uniform spattered with, he could not say the word. He was smiling. He told me I had done a fine job, that I had earned my pay. That night, sitting by the fire, listening to the silence from that valley, I understood what I had done. I had traded my skill, the one thing I was proud of, for blood money. I had helped a butcher murder a sleeping village. He fell silent. The confession was complete. It lay in the air between them, a terrible, wounded thing. Nora felt a tremor run through her body. a violent shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. It was the shock wave of his pain, his guilt. She felt a surge of pity so strong it was dizzying, followed by a cold spike of anger at Calloway, at the army, and a small, sharp sliver of it at the man standing before her. He had followed orders. He had been young, but he had led them. As if sensing her thoughts, he turned back to her. Afterward, they wanted to promote me, give me a commendation. I left, I took my pay, and I walked away. I never went back. I came here, to these mountains, where the only tracks I have to follow are my own. He finally looked at the colt, hanging high on the wall, a dark shape in the firelight. And I made a promise. I would never again use this to earn a wage or to settle a fight that was not about saving a life. I would not be a tool for another man's greed ever again. His story answered her questions, but it opened a dozen more within her own heart. The world was not as simple as good men and bad men. Here was a man who had done a monstrous thing, yet he was not a monster. He was a man drowning in a sea of regret. As she grappled with this new, complicated truth, a sound from the outside world intruded, a long, mournful howl, rising and falling on the wind. A wolf. Its cry was a lonely, wild thing, a reminder of the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded their small bubble of light and warmth. The cabin's old logs creaked in the wind, a low groan as if the house itself were in pain. Nora imagined she saw a shadow flicker past the small window, a fleeting shape in the moonlight. She flinched, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Beckett saw her fear. He moved slowly, deliberately. He walked to the corner where his hunting knife lay on a small shelf. He picked it up, not to brandish it, but to move it, placing it on the far side of the hearth, away from both of them. He then took the thickest woolen blanket from his own bunk and draped it carefully over her shoulders. He did not touch her. He just let the heavy warmth of the blanket settle around her. It was an act of pure, unadorned care. He was protecting her not just from the cold, but from her fear. He was trying to make her feel safe, even as his own story had filled the room with ghosts. And that was what finally broke her. It was not his confession. It was not the wolf. It was his quiet, respectful gentleness. That, combined with the crushing weight of the last few months, Liam's death, the town's cold shoulders, Mallory's sneering proposition, the sight of her husband's hat lying in a puddle of mud and filth, it all came crashing down on her at once. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips, a sound she could not hold back, then another, the dam of her composure, so carefully constructed, shattered into 1,000 pieces. The tears she had refused to shed for months streamed down her face, hot and cleansing. She did not know she was moving until she was on her feet. She crossed the small space between them and, without a thought, buried her face in the rough, clean fabric of his shirt. Her hands clutched at his arms, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing world. For a moment, he stood rigid with surprise. Then his arms came around her, slowly, hesitantly at first, then with a sure and steady strength. He did not pull her tight. He simply held her, creating a safe harbor for her grief. She wept, long and hard, for her lost husband, for her stolen future, for the terrifying loneliness that had been her constant companion. She was losing herself in the storm of it when his solidness, the steady rhythm of his breathing, began to pull her back. He was an anchor. She felt the warmth of his body seeping through her clothes, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. It was the heat of another living, breathing human being, and she realized how desperately she had missed that. Her sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. She did not want to move. She did not want him to let go. The world outside, the fight ahead, it all felt impossibly far away. Here, in this small circle of candlelight, held in the arms of this broken, honorable man, she felt a flicker of peace. She tilted her head back, looking up at him. His face, illuminated by the golden glow of the candle, was filled with a tenderness that stole her breath. her own voice. When she spoke was a raw, broken whisper, thick with tears and a need so profound it ached. "Don't stop," she said, the words catching in her throat. She closed her eyes, a fresh tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I need this," the widow cried as the cowboy held her inside his candlelit cabin. He heard the plea beneath her words. It was not a plea for passion, but for presence, for a moment's reprieve from the fight, for the simple, profound comfort of not being alone. He tightened his embrace just enough to let her know he had heard, that he understood. He rested his cheek against the top of her head, his own breathing slow and even. He did not try to soothe her with words. He just held her, offering his strength as a shield, his stillness as a balm. He was a man who had sworn off violence, and he was now discovering a different kind of strength, the power to stand firm and shelter another soul from the storm. They stood like that for a long time, while the wolf howled and the wind moaned and the fire crackled in the hearth. When her breathing had finally evened out, he spoke, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Tomorrow morning," he said softly, "we start bringing the truth into the light. Together." He paused, and she felt him take a deep breath. "But I meant what I said. Nora, I will not draw my gun first. I will not start the fight." She nodded against his chest. She understood. He was offering her his help, his knowledge, his courage, but he would not offer her the part of himself he had vowed to bury. It was a line he would not cross, and in that moment, she respected him for it more than ever. They eventually moved apart. He built up the fire, and she sat wrapped in the blanket, watching the flames. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, clean exhaustion. He did not press her to his bunk. He laid out a second thick blanket for himself on the floor by the hearth, a clear, unbreachable line drawn between them. The single candle on the table remained lit. It burned all through the long, cold night, its small, steady flame a silent witness. It was a fragile thing in the vast, dark wilderness, but it did not go out. It held its ground against the shadows, a tiny, stubborn beacon of hope. The candle flame had burned down to a sputtering nub by the time the first pale gray light of dawn crept through the cabin window. Nora awoke on the floor, wrapped in a cocoon of woolen blankets, feeling a sense of profound and utter exhaustion. But it was a clean feeling, like a field after a cleansing rain. The storm inside her had passed. She looked over at Beckett, who was already awake, sitting in a chair and staring into the dying embers of the fire. He had not slept. He had kept watch over her, and over the ghosts his story had summoned into the room. Their return to Dustwater was quiet, the air between them charged with a new, unspoken accord. The truth, in all its ugliness, was now a shared burden, and it had bonded them more securely than any promise. Their first stop was not Nora's homestead, but the warm, steamy kitchen of Mabel Quinn's boarding house. Mabel took one look at their tired, determined faces and knew this was more than a social call. She poured them both a mug of strong, black coffee and sat down at the heavy oak table, her expression serious. "All right," she said, her voice a low rumble. "Out with it. The whole sorry tale." Nora, her voice clear and steady, laid out everything. The anonymous note, the engineer's drawing, the discovery at stake marker 17, the attack by the river, and Sheriff Pike's deliberate obstruction of justice. Beckett sat beside her, a silent, solid presence, occasionally adding a quiet detail about the blasting cap wrapper or the military precision of the dam schematic. When they were finished, Mabel was quiet for a long time, her brow furrowed in thought. She tapped a thick finger on the tabletop, the sound like a slow, rhythmic drumbeat. Finally, she let out a long sigh and rose from the table. She walked to a small, locked pantry in the corner of the kitchen, a place she usually reserved for her best preserves and private stock of whiskey. She returned with a small, oilskin-wrapped ledger, The kind a shopkeeper might use. I never much cared for keeping books, she said, placing the ledger on the table with a soft thud. But I have a good memory for faces and figures, especially when the figures do not add up. She unwrapped the oilskin. Barrett Kane is a man who likes to pay for his loyalties in cash, thinks it leaves no trail, but cash has to be spent somewhere. She opened the book. The pages were filled with her neat, practical script, detailing the accounts of her boarders and saloon patrons. She flipped to a section at the back. Sheriff Pike, she said, pointing a finger at a series of entries. He does not gamble, and he drinks light. A man on his salary should have a modest tab, but for the last 6 months, he has been settling his account at the end of every week with fresh, crisp bank notes, always on a Friday, and always for an amount far greater than what he owes. She tapped another entry. Last week, he bought a new saddle, best leather, paid Silas in cash. 2 weeks before that, a new rifle, cash again. Then she pointed to a small, nearly invisible notation in the margin next to one of the larger payments. It was a simple, hastily drawn cross. What is that? Nora asked. That, Mabel said, her voice grim, is a witness. Deacon O'Rourke was in here one afternoon having a cup of tea when Kane's man Mallory came in to have a quiet word with the sheriff. The deacon has good ears. He heard Mallory tell Pike that Mr. Kane was pleased with his discretion and that his weekly stipend would continue as long as he remembered who signed his paycheck. The deacon told me Mallory passed him a thick envelope, said he felt the devil himself had just walked through his saloon. He was afraid to speak of it. Kane's reach extends even to the pulpit. It seems it was the missing piece, the link between Kane's money and the law's silence. They now had motive, means, and a conspiracy, but it was still their word against the most powerful man in the territory. We need more than just us, Beckett said, his voice quiet but firm. Kane is poisoning the water. We are not the only ones who will suffer. That afternoon, Ephraim Dodd set out on his old mule. He did not go to the big ranchers, the ones who were already in Kane's pocket. He went to the small homesteads downstream, to the families who relied on the clear water of Hart's Run for their few head of cattle, their vegetable gardens, their children. He was not a man of many words, but he spoke the simple, hard truth. He told them about the silt, about the dead fish, about the schematic that proved Kane's intent to steal the creek for himself. At first, the farmers were afraid. To stand against Kane was to risk everything, but Dodd spoke of their children drinking tainted water, of their livestock sickening, of their land withering. Fear gave way to a slow, simmering anger. By nightfall, a small, stubborn alliance of the dispossessed had been formed. They met that night in the back room of Mabel's saloon, a makeshift council of war. There was Nora, Beckett, Mabel, and Dodd, joined by 3 grim-faced ranchers whose entire livelihoods depended on the creek. We have proof, Nora said, but Pike will bury it and Kane will deny it. We need to get the truth out, and we need to do it in a way no one can ignore. They devised a 2-pronged attack. The first was Nora's idea, the Cheyenne Daily Leader. She said, "They are not on Kane's payroll. I will write a letter to the editor. I will detail everything, the foreclosure, the murder of my husband, the theft of the water. I will sign my name to it." The second part of the plan came from Beckett. His scout's mind saw the landscape as a weapon. Proof needs to be seen, he said. Words on paper can be dismissed as lies. We need to show them. I know a tanner on the North Fork who uses a powerful powdered dye, a deep, blood red. If we put enough of it into the creek upstream from the diversion point, when Kane's men open their floodgates, the evidence of their theft will flow right through the middle of town for everyone to see. The plan was audacious and dangerous, but it was a plan born of desperation, and it was unanimously approved. Mabel, who had been listening intently, slammed her fist on the table with a grin. She disappeared for a moment and returned with a heavy, long-barreled Colt revolver, which she began to clean with a practiced hand. "Just in case things get lively," she said with a wink. "My hands are not much good for knitting wool." but they are pretty good at knitting holes in a bad man's backside." The men chuckled, and for a moment, the heavy tension in the room lifted. The next day, Nora confronted Sheriff Pike one last time. She found him outside the general store, trying to look busy examining a new axe handle. "The creek is dying, Sheriff," she said, her voice carrying so that several passers-by could hear, "and you know why." Pike's face flushed. "That is a matter for the Water Commission," he mumbled, refusing to meet her eyes. "There is no Water Commission," she pressed, stepping closer. "There is only you. And him. So tell me, Sheriff, which are you protecting, that badge on your chest or the money in your pocket?" Pike flinched as if she had struck him. He looked around, seeing the curious, judging eyes of his fellow townspeople. He stammered something about public order, turned, and retreated into his office, closing the door firmly behind him. Nora had her answer. That night, under the cover of a moonless, overcast sky, she and Beckett rode upstream. They carried 2 heavy canvas sacks of the crimson dye. They moved like ghosts, their horses' hooves muffled by the soft earth near the bank. They found a place where the current was fast and deep and emptied the contents of the sacks into the churning water. The dye was instantly swallowed by the darkness, leaving no trace. Their work was done. The next morning, at the first light of dawn, it happened. Kane's men, arrogant in their presumed secrecy, opened the sluice gates on their illegal dam. In town, people were just beginning their day when the first trickle of color appeared in the diversion channel that ran past the new coaling station. Within minutes, the trickle became a torrent. A river of vivid, shocking red flowed through the heart of Kane's operation, an undeniable artery of guilt. People gathered on the street, pointing and murmuring. There, in living color, was the proof of the stories that had been whispered for weeks. The water that should have been flowing past the small farms downstream was being stolen, dyed red like a sinner's hands. Kane's response was swift and brutal. Vince Mallory, his face a mask of fury, rode into town with a half-dozen of his men. They did not go for Nora, they went for Mabel. They stormed into the saloon, dragged her out into the street, and accused her of slander, of inciting public unrest. "You are under arrest," Mallory snarled, waving a piece of paper he claimed was a warrant. 2 of his men grabbed Mabel's arms and began tying her hands. The town square fell silent. This was a direct assault on the heart of the community. But fear was a powerful anesthetic. The crowd just watched, frozen. Beckett appeared as if from nowhere. He walked calmly into the center of the square, his hands empty and at his sides. He was not wearing his gun. "Let her go, Mallory," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a deadly authority. Mallory laughed. "Or what, horseman? You going to stare us down?" Beckett did not answer with words. He moved. It was a blur of motion, economical and explosive. He sidestepped the lunge of one man, using the man's own momentum to send him sprawling. As the second man turned, Beckett's hand shot out, not with a fist, but with the blade of his hunting knife, which had appeared in his hand as if by magic. He did not slash at the man. He slashed the rope binding Mabel's wrists, in the same fluid motion. He spun, the flat of the heavy blade catching the man on the side of the head with a dull thud. The man crumpled. Mallory, stunned, reached for his pistol, but Beckett was already there. He kicked the gun from Mallory's hand and sent him stumbling back into the horse trough with a powerful shove. It was over in less than 5 seconds. No shots fired, no one seriously injured, but the message was unmistakable. As Mallory's men helped their sputtering boss from the trough, Nora walked to the town notice board, a hammer in one hand, a copy of the dam schematic in the other. Every eye in the square turned to her. She held the paper flat against the weathered wood and drove a heavy iron nail straight through its center with a single, powerful blow. The sharp, metallic crack echoed through the silent square. It was the sound of a battle line being drawn, as if the heavens themselves were weighing in. The sky, which had been clear at dawn, turned a dark, angry gray. A freak spring storm rolled in from the mountains with terrifying speed. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the streets to mud. Upstream, the poorly constructed test dam, never meant to hold back a real flood, buckled under the pressure. A wall of muddy, red-tinged water surged down the valley, overwhelming the diversion channel, flooding Kane's coaling station and washing away a dozen of his cattle pens. The ranchers who had been hesitant now saw their own barns and fields threatened by Kane's incompetence and greed. Their anger finally boiled over. Just as the storm began to subside, a rider entered town. It was not one of Kane's hired hands. It was Barrett Kane himself. He sat astride a magnificent black stallion, dressed in a fine black coat that seemed to repel the rain. He surveyed the scene, the sullen crowd, the flooded pens, the red water still trickling through the mud, and his face was like carved granite. He ignored the chaos his project had wrought and rode his horse directly to the notice board. Stopping before Nora's defiant declaration, he looked at it. Then he looked at her, his eyes cold and black as obsidian. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His words fell like chips of ice into the sudden silence. "By Sunday," he announced, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing back on Nora. "The heartland will be mine, one way or another." He wheeled his horse around and rode out of town, leaving behind a threat that was also a deadline. The countdown had begun. The 2 days before Sunday were a taut wire stretched to the breaking point. Kane's deadline hung over Dustwater like a thunderhead, and a nervous quiet settled on the town. There was no open aggression. But Nora saw Kane's men everywhere loitering on the boardwalk, watching her from the saloon, their presence a constant, low-grade threat. She and Beckett, along with Mabel and Dodd, spent the time preparing. They gathered sworn statements from the downstream ranchers about the damage to their land and livestock. Deacon O'Rourke, his conscience finally overriding his fear, agreed to testify about the payments he had witnessed. Nora's letter to the Cheyenne newspaper was sent with a rider sworn to speed and secrecy. They were building a case, a fortress of words and facts. On Saturday afternoon, Nora knew she had to ride out to the Miller homestead, the farthest of their small group of allies. Jacob Miller was getting cold feet, and his wife had sent a boy with a worried note. If they were to present a united front, she had to keep him from breaking. "It is a trap," Beckett said, his voice flat. "He was checking the cinch on his own saddle in the yard behind Mabel's. Mallory knows you will have to hold the ranchers together. He will be waiting for you." "Then you should not come with me," Nora replied, pulling her own cinch tight. "They will be looking for both of us. A lone rider has a better chance of being ignored." "That is not a chance I am willing to take," he said, his jaws set. "We ride together." "No," she insisted, turning to face him. Her gray eyes were resolute. "This is my fight. Beckett, you have helped me more than I can say, but I will not lead you into a bullet. I will ride the open path. It is faster and in plain sight. They will not be so bold as to attack me in broad daylight on the main trail." He saw the iron will in her and knew he could not argue, but he also knew she was wrong. Boldness was all men like Mallory had. He watched her ride out, a solitary, determined figure heading west. He waited exactly 5 minutes. Then he mounted his own horse and cut north, taking a circuitous route through the rocky, wooded foothills that overlooked the main trail. He would shadow her, a ghost in the trees. He would honor her wish to ride alone, but he would not leave her unprotected. The trail to the Miller place cut through a narrow pass known as Hummingbird Slope, a steep incline flanked by dense pine forest and jagged rock formations. It was a place made for an ambush. As Nora guided Agnes up the winding path, she felt a prickle of unease. The woods were too quiet. The usual chatter of birds and squirrels was absent. Agnes felt it too, her ears twitching nervously, her pace slowing. It happened without warning. 3 riders emerged from the trees in front of her, blocking the path. 2 more appeared behind her, cutting off her retreat. It was Vince Mallory, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. "Well, well, Mrs. Hart," he drawled, his men fanning out to surround her. "Fancy meeting you all the way out here. I believe we have some unfinished business." Nora's heart hammered against her ribs, but she kept her face a calm, cold mask. "My only business is with Mr. Miller. Let me pass." "I do not think so," Mallory said, his smirk widening. "Mr. Kane feels you have been a poor neighbor, stirring up trouble, telling lies. He asked us to educate you on the importance of minding your own affairs, a lesson you will not soon forget." Beckett saw it all from a ridge 100 yards above. He had been tracking them for the last mile, his blood growing colder with every hoofprint he saw that was not Nora's. The broken twig, the displaced rock, the unnatural silence the trail had screamed of the trap ahead. Now, seeing her surrounded, a cold, focused rage unlike anything he had felt since Fort Laramie settled over him. His heart pounded a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs, a war drum calling him to action. He slid from his saddle, tethering his horse in a thicket of brush. He moved through the trees with the silence of a predator, his moccasins making no sound on the pine needles. He circled around, coming up behind the two men who blocked Nora's escape route. He had his knife in his hand, and his promise to himself. The vow that had defined his last 5 years was a burning coal in his gut. He would not use the Colt. He was on them before they knew he was there. He brought the heavy pommel of his knife down on the back of one man's head, a single, precise blow that sent the man slumping from his saddle without a sound. The second man turned, his eyes wide with shock, reaching for his gun. Beckett was already moving. He grabbed the man's gun arm, twisting it viciously until the pistol dropped from his nerveless fingers. A powerful shove sent the man tumbling to the ground. "Mallory!" someone yelled. The other 3 men spun around, their faces a mixture of confusion and anger. Beckett stood alone in the trail, his feet planted, his knife held low and ready. "Let her go," he said, his voice a low growl. "The horseman," Mallory sneered, recovering from his surprise. "Come to play the hero, he and the remaining man drew their pistols. 2 against 1. Scout, I like those odds." Beckett did not hesitate. He uncoiled the thick leather rein from his saddle horn, a long, heavy strap. He moved forward, not in a straight line, but in a weaving, unpredictable pattern. The first man fired, the shot echoing like a thunderclap in the narrow pass. The bullet chewed into the dirt where Beckett had been a second before. Beckett snapped the rein like a whip. The heavy leather end caught the man across the face with a sickening crack, sending him reeling back, clutching his bleeding cheek. But in that split second, Mallory had moved. He spurred his horse forward, closing the distance to Nora. Before she could react, he had grabbed her, yanking her from her saddle and dragging her in front of him. He pressed the cold, round muzzle of his pistol hard against her temple. "That is enough," Mallory screamed, his voice strained with a nervous tremor. Nora was a shield, a human shield. "Drop the knife. Scout, drop it now, or I swear I will scatter her brains all over these rocks." Beckett froze. The world narrowed to a single, terrifying point, the black hole of the gun barrel pressed against Nora's skin. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also a stubborn refusal to break. His knife felt useless in his hand. The rein lay limp on the ground. He was 15 yards away, too far. He could not close the distance before Mallory pulled the trigger. His vow, his promise, his 5 years of penance, they all turned to ash in his mouth. "I said drop it," Mallory shrieked, his panic rising. He cocked the hammer of his pistol. The click was the loudest sound Beckett had ever heard. In that moment, there was no choice. There was no vow. There was only Nora. He let the knife fall from his hand. He did not raise his arms in surrender. With a movement that was unnaturally smooth and blindingly fast, his right hand swept down, his fingers closing around the familiar, checkered grip of the Colt peacemaker. He drew the gun. It was the first time he had drawn it in anger, the first time he had broken his oath. In 5 long, agonizing years, the sound of the hammer being thumbed back was lost in the roar in his own ears. The gun bucked in his hand, a living thing. The explosion was not a crack, but a deafening, sky-splitting tear in the fabric of the world. It was the sound of a promise being shattered. Mallory cried out, a sharp, ragged sound of pain and surprise. The gun fell from his hand, clattering on the rocks. He slumped forward, his left shoulder a sudden, blossoming flower of red. Nora, released from his grasp, stumbled away, catching herself before she fell. The last of Mallory's men, seeing his boss go down, stared at Beckett for a moment in stark terror, then wheeled his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the trees. Silence descended on Hummingbird Slope, a ringing, profound silence broken only by Mallory's groaning and the panicked breathing of the horses. Nora was safe, but Beckett stood as if frozen, the Colt still smoking in his hand. The weight of it was immense, a physical burden of guilt. He had broken his word. He had become the man he swore he would never be again. But as he looked at Nora, saw that she was alive, that she was unharmed, a new, strange feeling pushed through the guilt. He did not feel damned. He felt right. He had not killed. He had saved. The gun was still just a tool, but this time, he had been the one to choose its purpose. He holstered the Colt, the motion stiff and unfamiliar. He walked over to where Mallory was slumped over his horse's neck, clutching his bleeding shoulder. He pulled the man down and, with a length of rope, tied his hands securely. A short time later, Deacon O'Rourke arrived on the scene, having been sent for by one of the Miller boys who had seen the confrontation from a distance. The deacon's face was pale, but his eyes were resolute. In the dappled sunlight filtering through the pines, with the smell of gunpowder still hanging in the air, Beckett forced the wounded foreman to confess, with the deacon as a witness. Mallory, his voice raspy with pain, admitted everything that Barrett Kane had ordered him to sabotage the bridge, that Liam Hart's death was a deliberate murder to get his land, that the foreclosure notice was a fraud. The deacon wrote it all down on a piece of parchment, his hand shaking but his script firm. Mallory signed it with a bloody thumbprint. The deacon sealed the document with a drop of wax from a candle stub he carried for emergencies, pressing his small, silver cross into the soft wax as an official seal. They left Mallory tied for the sheriff to find and rode a short distance into the woods, away from the scene. Beckett slid from his saddle, a wave of dizziness washing over him. He leaned against a tree, pressing a hand to his side. In the chaos, he had not realized that one of Mallory's first wild shots had grazed him, tearing a shallow but bloody furrow along his ribs. Nora was at his side in an instant. "You are hurt," she breathed, her eyes wide with concern. She helped him sit, his back against the rough bark of a pine. She opened his shirt, revealing the angry, weeping wound. Without hesitation, she took a clean handkerchief from her pocket. It was made of fine linen, and in the corner, embroidered in neat blue thread, was a single letter, H. It was Liam's. For a moment, she paused, her hand trembling. Then, with a steadying breath, she uncorked her canteen and began to gently clean the wound. Her tears fell, silent drops that mingled with the water and the blood. But her hands were firm, her touch sure. Beckett winced as the cold water touched his skin. "Hurts like a horse kick," he grumbled, his voice tight with pain. Nora looked at him, a small, watery smile touching her lips. She finished tying the handkerchief into a tight bandage. "A horse kicks with a lot less noise than you are making," she retorted softly. He looked down at the bandage, at the blue H now stained with his own blood. He looked at her face, saw the tear tracks on her cheeks, and the fierce, protective light in her eyes. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the copy of the dam schematic. As he held it, a single drop of his blood fell from the wound in his side and landed on the paper. A crimson starburst right next to Mallory's signature. It was the price. The cost of bringing the truth into the light, paid in broken vows and shared blood. That evening, Deacon O'Rourke did not wait for Sunday. He gave the signed confession to Tom Nettles, the young, fast mail rider. He pressed a wad of bills into the boy's hand. "Ride like the devil is on your tail," the deacon commanded. "There is a circuit judge, a man named Harrison, in Cheyenne. He is a hard man, but an honest one. Give this only to him. Tell him justice in Dustwater cannot wait another day." As Tom Nettles disappeared in a cloud of dust, a fragile tendril of hope began to push its way through the fear that had gripped the town. The clock was still ticking, but now they had a weapon, and they had a chance. The arrival of the law was not a triumphant charge of cavalry. It was a single, dust-caked stagecoach that rattled to a halt in the middle of Dustwater's main street just as the sun began to bleed across the western horizon. The sky was a raw, angry palette of orange and purple, and the long shadows of the buildings fell across the street like prison bars. A man stepped out of the coach, tall and gaunt, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from dried leather. He wore a black frock coat, dusty from the trail, and his eyes, deep-set and piercing, missed nothing. This was Circuit Judge Isaac Harrison, a man whose reputation for unbending, unsentimental justice was known from Cheyenne to the Dakota border. He had received the deacon's frantic message and ridden for 24 straight hours, foregoing sleep for the sake of a confession sealed with a cross. He did not ask for a courtroom. He looked at the assembled, nervous faces of the townsfolk, at the imposing facade of the North Spur and Cattle Company office, and at the small, determined group standing with Nora Hart. He understood that justice, in this case, needed to be a public spectacle. "Bring me a table," he commanded, his voice a dry rasp that carried in the chilly evening air. A table and 3 chairs were brought from Mabel's saloon and placed directly in the center of the street. Judge Harrison took his seat, the setting sun at his back, casting his face in shadow. He was no longer just a man. He was an icon of the law, impartial and formidable. Barrett Kane, flanked by his well-dressed lawyer from Cheyenne, took one of the remaining chairs, his expression one of supreme, arrogant confidence. He looked upon the proceedings as a minor annoyance, a piece of administrative untidiness that would soon be swept away. The 3rd chair remained empty, a silent invitation to the truth. The town gathered, a living, breathing wall of humanity on both sides of the makeshift court. They were a community cleaved in two. On one side stood the men on Kane's payroll, the ranchers who leased his land, and the merchants who feared his power. On the other stood the small farmers, the miners, Mabel Quinn with a shotgun cradled in her arms, Ephraim Dodd, Deacon O'Rourke, and Beckett Cole, who stood just behind Nora, his hand resting near, but not on, the butt of his Colt. "I have read the sworn confession of a man named Vincent Mallory," the judge began, his voice cutting through the tension. "It makes some serious allegations. I will now hear any other evidence pertaining to this matter." One by one, they stepped forward. Mabel Quinn presented her ledger, its pages a damning account of Sheriff Pike's unexplained wealth. Deacon O'Rourke, his voice trembling but clear, read Mallory's confession aloud, every word dropping into the silence like a stone into a deep well. A young boy brought forward a glass jar filled with the foul, red-tinged water from Hart's Run, a tangible symbol of Kane's poison. Finally! Nora placed the dam schematic on the table. The drop of Beckett's dried blood on the paper was a small, dark star next to Mallory's name. Through it all, Kane sat impassively, a faint, condescending smile on his lips. When Nora was finished, his lawyer stood up, a sheaf of papers in his hand. "Your Honor," the lawyer began, his voice smooth and oiled, "while this is all very dramatic, it is also irrelevant. This is a simple matter of a defaulted loan. We have here a legally executed lien against the Hart property for the non-payment of taxes. Taxes which my client, Mr. Kane, generously paid on Mrs. Hart's behalf to save her from eviction by the county. He has been more than patient. He handed the document to the judge. It was expertly forged, filled with legal terminology and bearing what looked like an official county seal. It was a lie so perfectly constructed it looked more real than the truth. Judge Harrison studied the document, his expression unreadable. A very serious counterclaim, he said, his eyes lifting from the paper. He scanned the crowd. Sheriff Amos Pike, step forward. A collective intake of breath rippled through the onlookers. Sheriff Pike, who had been trying to make himself invisible at the edge of the crowd, flinched as if he had been struck. Every eye in town turned to him. He was the law. He was the pivot upon which this entire affair now turned. He shuffled forward, his boots dragging in the dust, his face the color of ash. He took off his hat, twisting the brim in his sweaty hands. "Sheriff," the judge said, his voice cold and hard, "you are the legal authority in this district. You are familiar with tax records. Is this document legitimate?" Pike looked at the paper. Then he looked at Barrett Kane, who gave him a look of pure, cold command. Then his eyes drifted to Nora, to her pale, determined face. He saw the expectation, the faint glimmer of hope that he might, for once, do the right thing. He saw his town, his people, waiting for him to choose a side. The silence stretched for a full minute, an eternity of indecision. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. When he spoke, his voice was a broken, shaking whisper, but every person in the street heard it. "No, Your Honor," he said, his eyes finally looking straight at the judge. "It is a fake." He took a ragged breath. I took money from Mr. Kane every week. He paid me to look the other way. He paid me to lose evidence. He paid me to lie." A gasp went through the crowd. The quiet admission was more shocking than any gunshot. The division in the town became physical. Kane's supporters looked stunned, betrayed. The others, Nora's allies, straightened their shoulders, a surge of righteous anger replacing their fear. The balance of power had just shifted. But Beckett was not watching the crowd. His scout's eyes were scanning, constantly moving, reading the landscape of the town as he would a dangerous canyon. He saw a flicker of movement on the flat roof of the general store opposite them, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadow of a water barrel. Then, the unmistakable glint of the setting sun on a long rifle barrel. There were two of them, hired guns, Kane's insurance policy. They were taking aim, their target clear in the fading light. "Nora!" Down Beckett's voice was not a shout, but a sharp, explosive command. He did not wait for her to react. He threw himself forward, shoving her hard. She stumbled and fell to the ground just as the rifle on the roof cracked. The bullet, meant for her heart, shrieked through the air where she had been standing and slammed into the wooden post holding the saloon sign. The sign, emblazoned with a faded painting of a laughing woman, splintered violently, showering the ground with wooden shrapnel. Panic erupted. People screamed and scattered, but before the gunman on the roof could fire again, something extraordinary happened. The town, which had been a passive audience, became an active participant. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man named Gus, let out a roar of rage and charged toward the general store, a heavy hammer in his hand. Ephraim Dodd melted into the alleyway, his old hunting rifle appearing in his hands. Mabel Quinn leveled her shotgun at the rooftop. The farmers and ranchers surged forward, a wave of ordinary, angry men, no longer willing to be afraid. They swarmed the building from the front and the back. The two hired guns, seeing the entire town rising up against them, panicked. They were disarmed and dragged down into the street within minutes, their faces bloodied and their fight gone. Judge Harrison had not moved. He had not even flinched. He sat at his table amidst the chaos, a pillar of calm. When the two gunmen were thrown at his feet, he simply glanced at them and then back at Barrett Kane. "It seems your methods of legal debate are as fraudulent as your documents. Mr. Kane," he said, his voice laced with icy contempt. He stood up, his full height seeming to cast a shadow over the entire street. My verdict is as follows. The foreclosure action against the Hart property is hereby declared null and void. The North Spur and Cattle Company will pay a fine of $5,000 to the territory for the willful destruction of a public waterway, and I am issuing a warrant for the immediate arrest of Barrett Kane on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder, to be held for the state. For a moment, it seemed that justice had won. The crowd let out a ragged, relieved cheer, but Barrett Kane was not a man to be cornered. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant composure, twisted into a snarl of pure, feral rage. He was a king whose kingdom had just crumbled, and he had one last, desperate move to make. With a speed that defied his size, he lunged, not at the judge, but at one of the stunned guards who had been escorting the gunman. He snatched the pistol from the man's holster and spun, bringing the gun up, his aim unerring. He did not aim at the judge. He aimed at Nora, the woman who had brought his empire down. Beckett was already moving. He had been inching closer to Nora from the moment the first shot was fired. He saw the madness in Kane's eyes, saw the gun coming around. He did not think, he reacted. He threw himself in front of Nora, a human shield. The world exploded in a flash of fire and a clap of thunder. Beckett felt a massive, brutal punch to his right shoulder, a force so powerful it spun him around and knocked him to his knees. A searing, white-hot pain radiated through his entire body. He looked down and saw the dark, spreading stain on his shirt. He had shielded her. He had taken the bullet meant for her. Before Kane could fire again, another shot rang out. This one came from Sheriff Pike. The disgraced lawman stood 20 feet away, his own pistol extended, smoke curling from the barrel. It was not a killing shot. It was the shot of a man finally, belatedly, doing his job. The bullet took Barrett Kane in the leg. He screamed, a high, thin sound of shock and pain, and collapsed in the dust, his pistol skittering away. Sheriff Pike walked forward, his face grim, his movements steady. He kicked the gun away from Kane's reach and then knelt, snapping a pair of handcuffs onto the fallen man's wrists. The fight was over. The crowd did not cheer this time. They stood in stunned silence, watching the scene with a kind of weary sadness. This was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a wound that had been lanced, a sickness that had been purged, and the process had been ugly and bloody. They were just relieved it was finally done. As Deacon O'Rourke and Mabel rushed to help the wounded Beckett, Ephraim Dodd slipped away from the crowd. He walked to the small, makeshift train station at the end of the street, where a tattered, sun-faded American flag hung limply from a pole. Slowly, with a quiet reverence, he untied the rope and lowered the flag to half-mast. It was a gesture of mourning for the men who had died, for the innocence the town had lost. But it was also a salute, a quiet acknowledgement of a new, hard-won beginning. The bullet had passed clean through. That was the one small mercy in the violent climax of Dustwater's fight for its soul. The town's sawbones, a weary man who had seen more than his share of lead poisoning, declared that Beckett's shoulder would heal clean if he did not get a fever. And so, he found himself a prisoner, not of the law, but of Mabel Quinn's best guest room, a place of starched white sheets and the faint, comforting scent of lavender. Nora became his nurse, his keeper, in the quiet, lamplit evenings. After Mabel had brought up a tray of broth and bread, she would change his bandage. Her hands, which she had once thought were only good for the heavy work of the forge, moved with a surprising, gentle dexterity. She cleaned the wound with carbolic and water, her touch so light it barely registered, then expertly wrapped it in fresh linen strips. Beckett, who had faced down charging cavalry and cornered grizzlies without flinching, endured her ministrations with a stoic silence that was almost comical. He sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, his good arm braced, his jaw tight. "You know," he said one evening, his voice a low grumble as she knotted a new bandage, "I believe I would sooner face a firing squad than that sewing needle of yours." Nora looked up, a small, tired smile gracing her lips. "It is not a sewing needle, it is a surgical one, for picking out the bits of cloth from your shirt." She finished her work and began to gather the soiled linens. "And for a man who took a bullet without making a sound, you complain an awful lot about a little poke." "The bullet was honest about its intentions," he retorted, a faint twinkle in his pale eyes. "The needle is sneaky." Their banter was a fragile bridge being built over the chasm of what they had endured. It was in these quiet moments, with the rest of the town a distant murmur below, that the space between them began to fill with something other than shared danger. But for Nora, it was a complicated space, crowded with ghosts. One night, after she had finished tending to his shoulder, she did not leave. She sat in the small wooden chair by the window, looking out at the single, muddy street, now quiet and peaceful under a blanket of stars. "When I was a girl," she began, her voice soft, almost a whisper, "I thought a heart was a simple thing, like a box. You put one person in it, and you locked the door, and that was that." She traced a pattern on the frosted window pane. "When Liam died, the box was shattered. I spent all my time just trying to hold the broken pieces together, to keep his memory safe inside." Beckett listened, his face unreadable in the dim light. He did not speak, did not prompt her. He just gave her the rare gift of his complete, unwavering attention. "Now," she continued, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name, "I feel it is as if I am trying to build a new room onto a ruined house. It feels wrong, disloyal." She finally turned from the window and looked at him, her gray eyes filled with a profound and honest confusion. "When I am with you, Beckett, I do not forget him, but for a little while, the broken pieces do not feel so sharp, and that feeling scares me more than anything Barrett Kane ever did." The old Beckett, the man who lived in the mountains, would have retreated into silence. He would have let her words hang in the air and die, unable to bear their emotional weight. But the man who had taken a bullet for her was different. He had put down roots in this new, uncertain ground. He shifted, wincing a little as the movement pulled at his stitches. "Nora," he said, his voice gentle, "Liam's memory has a place. No one, least of all me, is trying to take that away. A heart is not a box. Maybe it is more like a piece of land. Just because you build a new cabin on it does not mean you have to tear down the old one. They can stand side by side." His words were simple, but they were a balm to her troubled soul. He was not trying to possess her, or to erase her past. He was offering to stand beside it. She gave him a small, watery smile of gratitude. And for the first time since the trial, a fragile, hopeful peace settled between them. While they healed in private, the town of Dustwater began its own public, painful process of recovery. Sheriff Amos Pike, his face a roadmap of shame and regret, walked into the saloon the day after the shooting, unpinned the tarnished star from his chest, and laid it on the bar. "I am not fit to wear this," he said to no one in particular. He turned and walked out, a free man for the first time in years, but a man without a purpose. In his absence, the town did something remarkable. They did not wait for the territorial governor to appoint a new lawman. They held a meeting in the street, the same street that had so recently been a battlefield. By a unanimous show of hands, they elected a temporary town council to keep the peace and manage their affairs. Gus the blacksmith, a man of few words and immense integrity, was chosen. Mabel Quinn, the town's fierce, unbending conscience, was another. And to complete the trio, they chose Deacon O'Rourke, a man who had learned that faith without action was a hollow vessel. The deacon's first act was to call a special service, not in the church, but outside, by the banks of the poisoned creek. Nearly the entire town attended. It was not a sermon of fire and brimstone. It was a quiet, humble apology. "We have all sinned," the deacon said, his voice carrying in the crisp air. "We have sinned the sin of silence. We saw injustice and we looked away. We heard lies and we chose to believe them because the truth was too dangerous. We let our fear become a sickness in our community, a poison in our souls, just as surely as Cain's greed has poisoned this water. He looked from face to face, his gaze lingering on Nora and Beckett, who stood at the edge of the crowd. Today, we ask for forgiveness, and we begin the work of cleansing. The work began the next morning. It was a baptism by labor. Gus the blacksmith organized the crews. The men, armed with shovels and pry bars, waded into the creek, clearing the sludge, dismantling the remnants of the illegal dam upstream. The women formed a bucket brigade, hauling away the foul-smelling silt. They worked side by side, the ranchers who had supported Cain and the farmers he had tried to ruin, their shared sweat washing away the divisions that had nearly destroyed them. It took 3 days of backbreaking work, but on the 4th day, Hart's Run began to flow clear again. A week later, Ephraim Dodd, who had been watching the water with a trapper's patience, let out a whoop of joy. Small, fingerling trout, a sign of a healthy stream, were darting in the shallows. The creek and the town was breathing again. The change in dust water was palpable. The suspicious sideways glances that had followed Nora for months were replaced with open, friendly nods. One afternoon, she returned to her homestead to find Gus and the 2 other men waiting for her. They were not there to intimidate her. They were there with a wagon full of fresh-cut pine posts and a roll of wire. "A woman ought to have a proper fence," Gus said. By way of explanation, they spent the rest of the day setting the posts, their hammers ringing out in a steady, companionable rhythm. The following day, the women of the town arrived with baskets of food and spent the afternoon helping her plant a small garden. Children, who had once been warned away from the widow's unlucky property, now chased each other in gleeful circles on the banks of the clean, gurgling creek. Her land was no longer just a piece of property to be defended. It was becoming a home, woven into the fabric of the community. Beckett, once his shoulder was strong enough, did not return to his mountain exile. The solitude he had once craved now felt like an empty cage. He bought the small, abandoned livery at the edge of town, next to Nora's property, and with his own hands began to repair it. He was not a blacksmith, and he was not a rancher, but he understood horses. He started a small business, taking on the animals that other men had given up on the spooked, the stubborn, the difficult. He never used a harsh word or a heavy hand. He worked with them in a round pen, using a quiet voice and a patient, steady presence, until the fear left their eyes. He became known as the mender of difficult horses, a man who could heal the spirits of the broken. In healing them, he was also healing himself. He had left his past behind not by running from it, but by building a new, gentler life in its place. A new, comfortable rhythm settled into their lives. Every evening, after he had settled his horses, Beckett would walk over to Mabel's for his supper, and every evening, Nora would be there, sitting at a small table, a cup of tea before her. They would talk quietly, their conversation easy and unforced, about the mundane, wonderful details of their day, a stubborn fence post, a horse that had finally accepted a saddle, the price of flour, and before she left, Nora would always leave something on the counter for him, a single, wild daisy, or a sprig of purple aster, a small, silent token that spoke volumes. Mabel watched them, her sharp eyes missing nothing. One evening, as Nora was leaving her wildflower, Mabel came over, wiping the bar with a cloth. "You know," she said, her voice a theatrical grumble, "I am happy to provide the setting for all this slow-motion courting. It is good for business." She paused, fixing them both with a stern look. "But I am only going to say this once. If you two decide to get married, that is fine by me, but you had better be sure about it, because I am not making wedding candy twice." Nora blushed a shade of crimson that matched the sunset outside, while Beckett, for the first time she could remember, actually chuckled, a low, warm sound that made her heart skip a beat. Later that night, as Nora walked home, she looked at the reflection in the saloon's big glass window. The light from the lamps inside spilled out onto the street, painting the town in a warm, golden glow. Dustwater, which had once seemed so gray and unforgiving, was now a place of warmth, a place of light. The sound of a banjo drifted from an open doorway, a cheerful, plinking tune. The air smelled of wood smoke and Mabel's baking cornbread. From the livery, she could hear the soft nicker of a horse and Beckett's low, calming voice. The town was still a hard place, and the winters would still be long. But it was no longer just a place to survive. It was becoming a place to live. Summer arrived in the high country not as a gentle transition, but as a sudden, glorious announcement. The last of the snow vanished from the high peaks. The aspens unfurled leaves of a green so vibrant it ached, and Heart's Run, now flowing clear and full, sang a constant, bubbling song. The air, once sharp with the bite of ice, was now soft and fragrant with the scent of wild lupine and pine sap. On a morning like this, when the world felt scrubbed clean and new, Nora walked to the small cemetery at the edge of town. She carried a new cross, one she had fashioned herself from a piece of sturdy, smooth, sanded oak. She had spent weeks carving it, her hands steady, her heart quiet. She knelt by the mound of earth where Liam lay and gently removed the broken, splintered cross that had stood there for nearly a year. In its place, she set the new one, pressing its base firmly into the soft, dark soil. The wood was warm from the morning sun. Along the crossbeam, in letters carefully carved and stained dark with walnut, were 3 simple words: "Justice has come." She did not weep. The violent grief that had once consumed her had softened, over time, into a quiet, enduring ache of memory. She had fought for his name, and she had won. She had ensured his death was not just a forgotten tragedy, but a catalyst that had healed a broken town. She touched the carved letters, a final, fond farewell. She was not leaving him behind, but she was no longer bound to the anger and the sorrow of his ending. She was ready to begin her own next chapter. As she stood, she heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the path behind her. It was Beckett. He did not speak, did not intrude on her moment. He simply stood a respectful distance away, his hat in his hands, his presence a quiet comfort. His shoulder had healed, leaving behind a puckered, angry-looking scar that he now carried as a badge of his transformation, a mark not of a broken vow, but of a life saved. When she was ready, she turned to him, and he gave her a small, understanding smile. "I brought you something," he said, his voice as calm and steady as the mountains behind them. He led her to where his horse was tethered. Lying across a clean blanket on the ground was a saddle. It was a work of art, a masterpiece of leather and skill. It was a lady's side saddle, but it was built for use, not for show. The leather was a warm, rich brown, oiled to a soft, supple finish. The stitching was perfect, the work of a patient and careful hand. There was no fancy silver work, no ostentatious decoration, just the honest, beautiful craftsmanship of a man who understood his materials. "I made it for you," he said, a faint, shy pride in his voice. He ran a hand over the smooth leather of the seat. "It is light, but it is strong. The tree is solid pine, and the rigging is balanced, so it will not tire your horse." He looked up from the saddle and met her eyes, his own pale blue eyes filled with a sincerity that made her heart ache. "It is for you to ride wherever you want to go. Nora, to Cheyenne, to the mountains, to a new life somewhere far away from here. It is a saddle to take you anywhere, even if that is a place where you do not need me." It was the most selfless gift she had ever received. He was not trying to hold her, to fence her in. He was offering her the freedom to leave. He was telling her that her happiness, her independence, was more important to him than his own desire to have her stay. A wave of love for this quiet, gentle man, so strong and pure it almost brought her to her knees, washed over her. She reached out and touched the saddle, its surface warm and alive beneath her fingers. "It is beautiful. Beckett," she whispered, her voice thick. "But I have no plans to ride away." He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent question passing between them. Then, he reached into the pocket of his worn denim jacket. He did not pull out a velvet box. He pulled out a simple, coiled thong of braided leather. He let it unspool in his palm. Dangling from the end was a ring. It was silver, hammered into a plain, unadorned band, its surface bearing the faint, beautiful marks of the smith's tool. It was not a ring of wealth or status. It was a ring of substance, of honesty, of work. He did not kneel. He simply stood before her, the ring lying in his calloused palm, a small circle of promise in the bright morning light. "I am not a man of fancy words," he began, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I do not have much to offer. My past is full of shadows, and my future is just a small livery in a quiet piece of ground. But I know how to mend what is broken. I know how to be patient, and I know I do not want to see another sunrise without you." He took a slow breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "If you want a man to light the fire on cold mornings, to make the coffee, to stand with you and watch the seasons change, to keep the candle from going out on the windy nights, then I am asking you to be my wife." Tears welled in Nora's eyes, blurring his beloved, earnest face. They were not tears of sorrow or of fear, but of a joy so profound it felt like coming home after a long and brutal journey. She smiled, a radiant, tear-streaked smile that transformed her face. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." She looked at the simple, honest ring, then back at him. "But only if you remember one thing." He waited, his expression hopeful, questioning. "When I said, 'Don't stop, I need this,' in your cabin that night," she said, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper that was for him alone, "I was not just talking about an embrace. I was talking about this, about our life, together." He understood. He slid the cool, heavy silver ring from the leather thong and onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. He drew her into his arms, and this time, there were no ghosts, no fears, no unspoken histories between them. There was only the solid, wonderful reality of the present and the bright, open promise of the future. Their wedding was not a grand affair. It was held in the grassy yard behind the small church, under the shade of a towering cottonwood tree. The entire town was there, their presence a testament to the community they had all fought so hard to reclaim. Mabel Quinn, true to her word, baked a magnificent cake, a mountain of white frosting and wild strawberries. Deacon O'Rourke officiated, his voice filled with a genuine, paternal warmth as he spoke not of Scripture, but of the power of courage and the grace of second chances. From the edge of the crowd, a respectable distance away, Amos Pike stood and watched, his hat in his hands. When the deacon pronounced them man and wife, he did not cheer with the others. He simply gave a slow, solemn nod of apology and respect, then turned and walked away, a man beginning his own long, quiet journey of atonement. In the center of the long trestle table set up for the reception, in place of a fancy floral arrangement, sat a single, thick tallow candle inside a clear glass hurricane lamp. A strong summer wind whipped through the yard, rustling the leaves of the cottonwood and tugging at the lady's skirts. But inside its glass shield, the candle flame burned bright and steady, a small, stubborn beacon that would not be extinguished. In the distance, the steel rails of the North Spur line lay silent under the afternoon sun, no longer a symbol of ruthless power, but just a quiet, empty road, a tamed beast that had lost its teeth. Dustwater was still a hard town, a place where the winters would be long and the work would be unforgiving, but it was no longer a place of fear and isolation. It was a community. The people who had once been fractured by suspicion were now bound together by the shared memory of their struggle and their triumph. They had learned that justice was not something granted by a distant authority, but something that had to be forged, day by day, through collective action and courage. It was a town where people now had a home to return to, and neighbors they could count on. As the celebration began to wind down, in the soft, golden light of the late afternoon, Beckett went to the livery and returned leading Nora's mare, Agnes, now wearing her new, beautiful saddle. He helped Nora mount, then took up the reins of his own horse. They did not ride away. They walked, side by side, leading their horses down the gentle slope of her land toward the creek. They walked along the bank of Hart's Run, the water chuckling and sparkling over the smooth stones, its song now a happy, peaceful melody. The sun was low in the sky, casting their shadows long and intertwined on the new, green grass, a silent promise of all the roads they would now walk together. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.